The elites are panicking, and that should give us hope. A hard truth about the state of Western democracy and why the ruling class fears signals our greatest opportunity for renewal. This is the topic of today's Hammer Time. We live through a supreme time of irony. One is the promise that was made in the past. We were raised to believe that the West, especially the United Kingdom, London calls itself proudly the mother of parliaments, was the eternal home of liberty and democratic ideals. But of course, the truth is, or the reality now, is one that looks quite differently. Because in many of these nations that still pretend to live up to these ideals, the ruling classes, the establishment, has done a lot that, justifiably so, has shaken our trust and our confidence in these high and lofty ideals. Take a few of the things that have unfolded in recent weeks. In the UK, local elections are being postponed because there is fear that Nigel Farage's Reform Party could win. There is an attempt to replace trials that were conducted in front of a jury by simple trials to be judged by a single judge. We have more and more people in the UK, I think the last number I've read was 12,000, who are either arrested or dragged into court for social media posts. There's a general sense that freedom of speech and ancient liberties that so many people in the UK, but not just in the UK, in other places as well, have taken for granted, are being eroded. Now, on the one hand, this makes one very worried. It makes me worried too. But on the other hand, I would say this is the clearest sign of panic. This is the clearest sign of that, as an optimist would say, and I try always to be as optimistic as possible, that it could be an indicator that we are winning. Of course, it is also important to say, if a beast is cornered, it tends to lash out. So I think for the short to medium term, we will see much, much more of this. So therefore, it will be important that the reform parties, the reform movements, the new media, right, that they stick it out, that they stick together, that they will not allow themselves to be intimidated. And of course, and this is a little bit of an advertisement, if you will, for our own cause, that you support these new movements, that you support these new media, like Brussels Signal in our case, so that you can stay informed on what I would say is at the moment a peaceful but a significant civil strife. That there is a boiling point about to be reached among the people of Europe and those who govern above them. Now, that argument, and we talked about this plenty in the past, is always difficult to make because some would argue, this is all panic, right? There is no revolution on the horizon. There is no justified fear of civil war or civil unrest. And I agree that might be the most extreme scenario. But it cannot be denied that, like in a pressure cooker, if a system at some point doesn't have a relief valve, if there is no way for this pressure to burst out and find a way out, something is going to happen, something is going to break. So my sense is that maybe it's not going to be, as David Betts, who has been on our show and is a good friend of Brussels Signal, has anticipated, maybe it's not going to be civil war, right? Maybe it's not violent civil unrest. But something at some point has to give because people want those ancient liberalisms and these ancient liberties back. It is very absurd, right? There's very often the claim being made, well, what do these populists want? What do these new parties, what do they want? And the thing is, they don't really want revolutionary change. They want, to put it slightly differently, they want revolutionary change in the sense that they want many things to change so that things can actually stay the same. So if you want, it is a little bit the attempt of a quote unquote reactionary revolution. But I think these desires are absolutely justified. Because what we see unfolding is not a trend towards authoritarianism, as we've seen it in the past. So this is, as I call it on this slide, this isn't our grandfather's totalitarianism. Like, it's not with marching boots and dictators and visible oppression, like the kind of totalitarianism that we experienced in the 20th century, like with open and clear brutality. Although I would argue in some cases this is also increasing. It's a subtler form. It's something that Alexis de Tocqueville describes in democracy in America, when he says, it's ostracization. You make things harder for the individual. You make things harder for the people. So you are a comedian like Graham Linehan, and you say something that is maybe not particularly funny or mildly critical of, in his case, the LGBTQ community. And the reaction is that you'll be picked up by 5 police officers at the airport. Yeah, you're released afterwards, and maybe they apologize and say it was all a mistake. But everybody gets the message, right? The message is quite clear that if you say something against the quote-unquote regime, or if you say something against the selected groups the regime feels obliged to, then you must expect repercussions. So maybe it's better not to say anything. Maybe it's better to keep the things to yourself. Or if you take the case of Elon Musk, who has been fined with, I think it's 140 million US dollars for one of the reasons, because the blue check mark on X, it was once a trusted marker for trusted sources, but that is no longer the case. And that was one of the reasons why this fine is being justified. Yet, interestingly enough, you can also acquire a blue checkmark for your Meta accounts, Instagram, WhatsApp, Facebook. You also have it on LinkedIn, where in many cases the rules are almost precisely the same as on X. But why is Elon Musk fined and why is Meta not fined? I think everybody knows the answer to this question, right? Because he has been raising his voice, he has been supporting political movements that were outside the mainstream. So this is a form of a new tyranny, of a new form of totalitarianism. The complete negation, if you want, of the consequences of net zero, of mass migration, of destructive industrial policies. You have this interesting debate currently raging on online, and I'm sure that many of you probably saw the debate between Piers Morgan and Nick Fuentes. And I have to be completely honest, I have a very strong principle that I will relate to a little bit later, but which is that the truth content of a statement is in most cases entirely independent of the person who says or who makes the statement. So if I say that 2 + 2 = 4, whatever my past, whatever my character, whatever the very things that make me me, do not have any bearing on the truth of said statement. So why I'm saying this? Because whatever you think of many of the views of Nick Fuentes, who might disagree with forcefully on a lot of issues, but when he goes into a debate with Piers Morgan, and it appears that Piers Morgan does not understand the concept of per capita, I have to admit that, well, again, whatever you think of Mr. Fuentes as a person, it's like him saying 2 + 2 = 4, which even if, a person with abhorrent views in many other areas, it's a statement that does not become wrong. So, but I think this was why am I saying this? This was for me a revealing moment that even somebody like Piers Morgan apparently has a very hard time admitting that there are certain things in our society that go into the wrong direction. He made, by the way, a similar absurd statement in his conversation with Tucker Carlson, where he says, and I'm paraphrasing here slightly, my friend Connor Tomlinson goes into more detail, so check out his channel as well. Well, he says that, there are some downsides when it comes to mass migration and what happened in London, not everything is perfect, but at least now we got better curry restaurants. And again, this is a form of gaslighting I think that more and more people are wondering about. And it's this form of subtle, sophisticated gaslighting. Like, I'm a very sophisticated man, and it's only the rubes, it's the vulgar people, the hoi polloi, the rebel rousers, the deplorables, as Hillary Clinton would say, who are worried about maintaining a civilization, a culture, and traditions. It is, of course, also what Donald Trump or the Trump administration has been talking about in their most recent national security strategy, where they make the point that Europe is threatened by civilizational erasure. Europe is threatened by idiotic net zero politics, by mistaken politics in the area of mass migration, by wrong industrial policies. And I give you just a few headlines over the last 24 hours. Now, depending on when we're going to air this episode, but this is the weekend of December 14th. So over this one weekend, we had the New Year's concert on the Champs-Élysées in Paris cancelled for security concerns. We had the uncovering of a terrorist plot in Germany, where in a mosque in Bavaria, an Egyptian man, 3 Moroccans and 1 Syrian were both radicalized and also planned to plunge a car to drive a car into a Christmas market. And of course, with the terrorist attack in Australia, with on last count between 12 to 16 deaths, with a terrorist attack on a Jewish community, on Jewish festivities in Bondi Beach. And once again, this is treated as if it is something that just happens on a regular basis. Like, this is the price we have to pay for a multicultural society. But I don't think that most people would agree with this. I would even go a step further and say, I don't think that if this kind of violence would come, let's say, from right-wing groups. Imagine for a second there would be a weekend where you would have public concerts cancelled because of right-wing threats. If you would have terrorist plots by right-wingers against events like Christmas markets cancelled. If you would have one successful terrorist plot by right-wingers, would anybody really go out and say, well, this is just things that happen and we should not jump to conclusions, or we should not now give in to the temptation of Islamophobia, or as is now the case with this incident in Australia, where I say, but wasn't there like one which was heroic, right? The one man who tried to take the gun away from one of the terrorists, who himself is Muslim, which, great stuff, no doubt about it. But it doesn't really address the bigger problem. It doesn't address the broader question. I mean, would we have these problems if we would have conducted different policies in the past? And I think the answer is pretty clear to this. The answer is a resounding no. And I very often get the question as to who are those elites? Like, so people say, oh, Ralph, you use the term elites so often. You speak about the elites. Who are these elites? Isn't this just a boogeyman made up by the right? And I want to give you a very concrete example of what I mean by this. If you trace back, I want to stick with the migration topic for a second, because it is a very, very important topic. If you trace back the origins of the anti-migration movement, both in continental Europe, partially in the United States, but also in the United Kingdom, you can say it begins in the mid to end 60s. And you have interesting figures among this in this movement. Winston Churchill, Charles de Gaulle, right? Both people that probably, by today's standards, would be counted as far-righters, as far-right-wing political figures. Everybody is aware, and I mentioned a couple of times, Enoch Powell's famous Rivers of Blood speech from 1968, which, again, if you go back, there's a wonderful podcast by The Rest is History guys on Enoch Powell. And when you listen to it, I mean, even they admit at the end, even though they obviously do not agree with Enoch Powell's speech, but even they admit at the end that the feedback to his speech, both by the working class and average Britons, was overwhelming approval. So already in the 1960s in the UK, you had a very, very strong sentiment that migration is going in the wrong direction. You had the first anti-migrant parties come up in Germany at the time, in France. In Austria, it starts in the late 80s. So for 60 years, the people of Europe have voiced again and again and again that they want to change, a reversal in migration policies. Helmut Kohl, the German chancellor, said, well, the term guest worker usually implies that, as with all guests, even the guests you welcome, that at some point they leave. But they never did. So this is a very, very important element here, because all these new movements that are supposedly threats to democracy, they would not exist if over the last 60 years, the establishment would have listened to what people were saying time and again. Now, in defense of the people, they constantly, to an almost suicidal level, gave the establishment parties, the establishment media, the established institutions the benefit of the doubt. Right? They say, okay, now they're going to get it. Boris Johnson, right? He's going to get it, but he didn't. Friedrich Merz, he's going to get it, but he didn't. Emmanuel Macron, he's going to get it, but he didn't. It's just now, after 60 years, that the people are losing patience and they're saying, you know what, maybe we have to look for a new elite. Right? That they say, if the established elite is not addressing our problems, we have to look for a new one. For 60 years, everybody has said, maybe this is not going right? Maybe this is moving in the wrong direction, was immediately denounced as a fascist, a Nazi, a far right-winger, you name it, a white supremacist. And this is what I mean, because who did this name-calling? Who is responsible for it? And it was at the universities, it was at the cultural institutions, it was in the media, it was in particular those circles that I would then define as the elite, where you have a pronounced sentiment among the population, but instead of taking it seriously, they were insulted, they were denigrated. They were driven into, if you will, political exile. I mean, this is what you saw happening in 2016 with Donald Trump. Then, to the great surprise of everyone, if a politician arises that can speak to those who were in political exile, they will come back, right? They will join, which is a good thing, by the way, the democratic process. I'm sure they would have come back for somebody else as well, but nobody had the guts to speak to them. And this is, of course, a major problem. Now, what we also see now, a huge topic, justifiably so, is that the youth are radicalizing. And I have to say immediately that I don't necessarily use the term radicalizing here in a purely negative sense, because I can feel within myself, if you want, a certain tendency towards radicalization. There's a strong sense, a strong feeling that the longer we continue on the wrong path, the harder it will be to get back. And as the Canadian columnist and commentator Mark Steyn once wrote, we are nearing onto a situation where good people can no longer save us because they will not be willing to go to the lengths that are necessary. Now, I hope that this will not be the scenario. I hope that this is a warning that will not find its fulfillment. But if we stick for a second with said Mark Steyn, he wrote a wonderful book in the early 2000s called America Alone. And if you read his book, it's still available on Amazon. He's currently doing for the members of the Mark Steyn Club. He does an audio version of the book. I highly recommend it. I think you will not regret it. And for certain reasons, I think due to some health issues, I think Mr. Steyn deserves all the support he can get. He's been one of the most prescient voices in the English-speaking world. And pretty much, if you read his columns from 20 years ago, there are not many commentators and analysts who have been as spot on as he is. And I think he makes some very, very important points with it, that at some point, the people will lose patience. I like to make a somewhat medical comparison, or as I like to call it on this slide, that the doctor will see you now. So I think this is a very nice way, or a dramatic way, if you will, to look at this, which is, so 60 years ago, as I call it here, year one, hypothetically, metaphorically year one, 60 years ago, you go to the doctor and you say, there's a problem. As I said, Enoch Powell, right? It's kind of, if you want, as the first patient, in this case, Enoch Powell would be the patient, not the doctor. And he says, there's an issue. There's a problem, right? We can't continue the way we do things. And the doctor, the elites, the establishment says, this is nothing to worry about. Don't worry. You're alarmist. You're a hypochondriac. You shouldn't be too worried. So, take an aspirin and see me again in a couple of years. Then, again, hypothetically year two, the condition gets worse. Problems are increasing. Right? So, the people, once again, they return. There would be the Pat Buchanan movement in the United States, if you want, the so-called the Republicans, a party that arose in Germany, and they say, we really have to change something. It can't go on like this. But again, the doctor said, take an aspirin. It's fine. This is not going to be an issue. Well, then, you enter the 80s, you enter the 90s, and the situation hasn't improved. The situation actually got worse. So the disease, so to speak, has metastasized. And now, all of a sudden, the doctor says, oh my God, we have overlooked this. Right? This has always been one of, for me, the most annoying and aggravating things over the last couple of years, when the same politicians, the quote-unquote doctors, who said nothing to see here, nothing to worry, are now the ones who come out and say, oh my God, we were all wrong. Like, what are you talking about? The people have for a very long time made very clear that they are very concerned about the quote-unquote medical/political conditions we find ourselves in. And the aspirin, if you want, is no longer working. And the further along we have been ignoring, and I think we still are, that we are ignoring this problem, the more radical the treatment then, of course, has to be. So now it's no longer the aspirin, it's going to be chemotherapy, it's radiation, again, metaphorically speaking, whatever it then is, which is, take the issue of a term that is used a lot these days, take the concept of remigration. We would not even have this debate if we would have had more sensible migration policies in the past. We would not talk about deportations. We didn't talk about the issue of can you revoke citizenship. Like, again, I understand that this makes many people feel uncomfortable. I am among them. But the reason why we have these debates in the first place is because we neglected the justified and serious concerns of a significant part of the people, not just for the last 10 years, the last 15 years, but for the last 60 years. And at some point, the bill is going to come due. So as I say, that the political diagnosis, as I call it on this slide, is that for decades, legitimate concerns about social cohesion, national identity, economic decline were dismissed as alarmism, as bigotry, as demonized as extremism, as fascism, you name it. It was just name calling. It was never engaging with the issues. It was, you said, I see something that seems to be a problem. And the argument was, well, you're just a racist, you're a Nazi, you're a fascist. And it is no wonder then that, particularly as I started to say a couple of minutes ago, that among younger people, if you feel that things are going in the wrong direction and that the quote-unquote mainstream, the center, if you want, that they cannot address these problems, they will turn to the voices, they will turn to the representatives who sound more radical, who promise more radical change, who go over the top, who use much more extreme rhetoric. And even if you don't share the rhetoric, I think you have to view it as a symptom. And I can say from my own experience, people whom I trust, people whom I like very much, significantly younger than me, I can tell how their rhetoric has become more extreme over the last couple of years, over the last couple of decades. But that is completely understandable. Because at some point, it's not just, it's a sense of unfairness, right? That you feel betrayed by your political establishment. But then what also comes with it is you don't just want a return to quote-unquote normalization. You have also a sense, for lack of a better term, a desire for vengeance. Because you feel that what they have done, you no longer give them the benefit of the doubt, as so many did for 30, 40, 50 years. You say, okay, this was done on purpose. And this doesn't even mean that it has to be part of some great scheme or planned conspiracy. It was just the spirit of the age, if you want. It was the accepted social standards in academia, in media, in the halls of power, at the cocktail parties. What Rob Henderson calls the luxury beliefs that they could indulge in. And I think there is now a sense that it's not just enough to correct these policies. There's also a sense that at some point those responsible have to be punished. I mean, take another thing that I talk quite a bit about on this show because I think it's still not getting the attention that is necessary. I mean, look at what's currently happening with all these grooming gang processes in the United Kingdom. I think in South Yorkshire, the police apparently now, based on Mark Stein's reporting, again, I cannot recommend him warmly enough, what you can see there is that apparently they have lost documents. They have lost transcripts. They have lost witness statements. And at the same time, it also came up that apparently members of the police themselves were involved in the raping, in the abuse of young and very often underage girls. I mean, in any other country, this would be such an outcry. This would lead to the disappearance of the government in charge. Yet at the same time, right, we are being told, no, this is just overblown. There's so much more problems within the family, and it's the patriarchy, it's masculinity, it's masculine toxicity. And at some point, people stop believing it, and I think they're right to do so. We had similar cases. I think it was in Canada about supposed mass graves of children by the indigenous population, and as far as we know now, no bodies were ever found. So apparently, all of this was a huge hoax, for lack of a better term. But this was being treated up and down the media as something of deep concern and showing the racism or the racist heritage of Canada. Yet when we have real victims and real crime, as in the UK, barely anything ever happens. Or to use a last quote of Mark Stein, credit where credit is due, it seems that the UK, but more and more parts of Europe, are becoming countries where everything is policed except crime. I mean, we had cases in Europe where insulting a rapist on the phone or on social media led to a higher prison sentence than the rapist got for raping a woman. And all of this is in stark terms also mentioned in this new national security strategy by the Trump administration. And I'm very relieved, I have to say, that they take this civilizational crisis seriously. As Abraham Lincoln said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. And the same, of course, is very true in Europe. If you have a growing sentiment among the population that they are not in it together with their government, that this is not a national undertaking, if they turn, in a sense, against their governments, or if they believe that their governments, their states, their system have no legitimacy, you cannot be a good ally. And this is precisely what Donald Trump or his administration, what J.D. Vance for a long time has been saying. How can we rely on you? How can we trust you to be responsible, good allies if you don't even believe in yourself? And there has been a huge outcry that supposedly Donald Trump wants to divide Europe. He wants to abolish the European Union. But I can only encourage all of you to read the actual document. I think the very opposite is the case. They talk about a Europe that needs to be confident again, believe in its own history, that needs to reverse suicidal migration policies, that needs to abandon the Green New Deal and net zero madness. So these are all things, at least I would immediately put my signature to. Now there is another supposedly leaked document, but as far as I can tell, the White House has issued a dementi that that is from them. They have denied that it is from them, that some countries, Austria, Poland, Hungary, and Italy, that they want to kind of break them out of the European Union and then negotiate individually with them. But as I said, the White House denies that this is an authentic document. But even so, I mean, the point still stands that they want an ally they can rely on. They want a strong Europe, not a weak Europe. But they also say, and this is where the rubber hits the road, they also say that they do not believe that this can be achieved and accomplished with the current elites in charge. And I think that is really the true reason for the outcry. It's not, and I said this many times, it's not that it is Trump against Europe. It is Trump against the current European elites. And what these elites, however, have done, what they have accomplished, as I say on this slide, right, they have turned Europe from being a player into a piece on the chessboard. Because in the grand game of geopolitics, you're either a player or a piece on the board. And right now, Europe is unequivocally a piece on the board. And by the way, and this is also something that comes out of the new national security strategy, we don't even know if it's a good piece on the board. So we don't know if it's, if it's a queen or if it's a pawn. And that's another very, very important element. There is now this very attempt to blame all the failures of the European Union and of the European process on parties that didn't even exist 10, 15, 20 years ago. So it's like a collective amnesia among the European establishment that everything that happened in the past, the groundwork that was laid for the demise and the decline of Europe, had nothing to do with them. That this is, it just came out of nowhere. It had nothing to do with the politicians that were in charge in the past. And once again, take Germany as an example. Or the same, by the way, in the UK. You had supposedly conservative governments. Angela Merkel, Boris Johnson. And we would say, well, these are conservative governments. But did they govern conservatively? Did they govern in a way where you would say, okay, these were right-wing governments? No. And once again, this is why I believe that the concept of, whether we want to call it the uniparty or the establishment consensus, was there. There was no true alternative for the people. The same is also true, by the way, in the United States. Donald Trump, and I know there are now many critics of Donald Trump, that he's moving too slow, that he's not keeping his promises. And I agree with many of these criticisms. But I want everyone to keep in mind, Donald Trump is still governing not just against the Democrats, he's also governing against his own party. There's a huge part of the Republican Party who just want to sit his presidency out, and they hope that then we can return to the age of George W. Bush or Mitt Romney or whatever. Like the appointments that Trump made, the confirmation process is way too slow. He recently was caught in a hot mic making precisely this point. So how can you, as a single person, successfully govern if both your own party and the opposition party are against you? And this is a little bit the condition in which so many Europeans found themselves in recent years. That both the opposition party as well as the party in government, that it didn't matter if they were left of center or right of center or slightly left of right of center or slightly right of left of center, that whomever they voted for, they never got a change in politics. The Boris wave, and as I said, the Merkel wave, I guess, would also be a correct point to call it. And this is what we are coming to the end towards. And I say this again, for 60 years, the people gave the ruling elite the benefit of the doubt. And I think this time is coming to an end. The big question is, how will they react? Will they adapt? Will they be forced to do the right thing? Or will it be necessary for the people to find somebody who is willing to do the right thing? 2026, I think, will be a very interesting year. I hope you'll continue to join us at Brussels Signal as we can comment and observe these processes. And I wish you a wonderful Christmas, a wonderful New Year, and see you in 2026.